Hey everyone, it's a new week. That means it's time for SysAdmin Weekly. Now, a few years ago, Microsoft had a unfortunate litany of security incidents. And as a result of this, and a review by the CSRB, the Cyber Safety Review Board of the United States, they came up with what's called the Microsoft Secure Future Initiative. Now, when it first came out, it kind of seemed like a lot of marketing fluff, but they then put a lot of technical details behind it, and they've been making great strides to work towards that secure future, right? And so today I've got Paul Schnackenburg on the phone, and we're going to be talking about how Microsoft is coming with their Secure Future initiative. So that and lots more on today's episode of SysAdmin Weekly. Hey everyone, it's another week. That means it's time for SysAdmin Weekly. This, of course, is your weekly show brought to you by Project Runspace. You can reach that website at projectrunspace.org. And this is a show by sysadmins for sysadmins, those tireless folks working in the trenches day in and day out, keeping our digital world spinning. I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got a new face with me today. I've got Paul Schnackenburg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, normally I've got Eric on as my co-host. And, I figured, who have I done probably more podcast episodes with on other shows and other outlets than I have with Eric. And I'm like, well, that's Paul. And so when I started this show, I knew I was going to have Paul on the show at some point in time. Glad to have you here, my friend. It's always good talking to you.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I really appreciate it. I enjoy recording podcasts with you.
It's fun. We always have good conversations. So with that, Paul, just so folks that may not know who you are can kind of get to know you, why don't you give us a quick introduction to yourself?
Sure. So I'm originally from Sweden, but I moved to Australia back in 1998. So I've been here for 27 years now, I suppose it works out. I have run my own business for nearly the same time as an MSP. Well, we didn't call ourselves MSPs back in the day, but as an MSP, I have a few small business clients here on the Sunshine Coast of Australia that I take care of. I was a teacher part-time for a local, I suppose you'd call it a trade college, maybe in the US, that sort of equivalent. We have them all over Australia. It's called TAFE. So I was sort of training the next generation of IT professionals for roughly 20 years. Left that a few years ago. Still work as a Microsoft certified trainer. So I deliver trainings from home using the monitor behind me. And I've been in IT, for over 30 years now, which is a terrible thing to say out loud. But that's it.
Well, I was going to say, you've been a sysadmin for a long time. And again, This show, of course, is by sysadmins for sysadmins. And if I put my sysadmin hat back on, and back when I was in the trenches, doing sysadmin work, I will take as much good advice as I can possibly get, because, one evening you've got a dead server splayed across your desk and you're trying to revive it. And the next day you've got the CEO's laptop is dead. And I mean, those are just two examples, right? I mean, it's a thankless job. And I think I've said that every episode of this show I've recorded thus far. It is a thankless job, but we hope to share our knowledge and share Paul's knowledge with all of you today. And of course, today we are talking about Microsoft's Secure Future initiative. And so, if you're a sysadmin in the trenches, you're probably asking yourself, okay, well, why do I care about the Secure Future initiative, right? Why is this relevant to my day-to-day life in the trenches? Well, Microsoft making big shifts and changes in their security posture is going to impact all of us in some way, shape, or form, right? Sometimes in the shape of breaches, sometime in the shape of a change of a best practice, things like that. And so back, I want to say it was April 21st, Microsoft released an update, progress report, if you will, on where they're at with the Secure Future Initiative. And before I get into that, I guess the way I would describe the Secure Future Initiative, Paul, is maybe this is a comical way of doing it. The Secure Future Initiative was the result of a number of different security incidents at Microsoft. The one that broke the camel's back was the Storm 0558 attack. That was the attack where the attackers had lifted consumer signing keys and were able to forge their own Entra ID tokens, basically. So that one is about as bad as it can get, right? And so the Secure Future Initiative was kind of their, oh crap, we have to do something initiative to garner back trust and support, or at least attempt to do so, right? And you and I have done a couple of episodes on different podcasts around this topic, Paul. And I think, I don't want to speak for you, but at first, when the SFI came out, it just seemed to be a bunch of marketing fluff, right? I think you'd agree with that, probably.
We had one episode where we dissected the very first one, and it was very marketing. It was very much everything's fine here, nothing to see here. These are not the droids you're looking for. It's all good, Like it was literally a bit like that. But then came the CSRB report. I think that's what really set the fire under there.
Oh yeah,
that was a public shaming of quite a number of failings at Microsoft, and failings that you would not expect a company of that size with that kind of responsibility to make, and certainly not the series of them they make. I mean, there was 25 odd recommendations in the report, and 20 odd of them were specifically aimed at things that Microsoft should have been doing better. And it was a fair report. Like it wasn't somebody who didn't like Microsoft bashing Microsoft, if you know what I mean. No, it was literally factually based. Look, this is what happened. And I do remember they did check in with both Google and AWS at the time and said, if this had happened in your environment, would this have worked? And they were both like, no. That would not have worked, and that attack would not have worked, or those attacks wouldn't have worked in our environment. So a bit embarrassing for Microsoft, really. So they really did need to do something. I think that was the bottom line.
Exactly. And you mentioned the CSRB, the Cyber Safety Review Board here in the U.S. It's a government review board for situations like this. Yes, that's a whole different conversation and a different podcast episode. Anyway, that report was very well done, and I will include a link to that in the show notes because that's a good read. And like you said, it was a very good report, very solid recommendations, and all based in fact, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, to me, this was like they were, okay, we need to do something to get public support back. And I feel like now that it's 6 months plus onward from the initial announcement, they've kind of gotten away from the marketing doublespeak and things like that. And now we're actually starting to see rubber meet road, right? They're actually starting to do some things, which is nice to see. And so what I figured we could do with this episode, Paul, is kind of step through what they've done so far, talk about their progress report, basically, and ultimately we can talk about how this impacts sysadmins in the trenches eventually. So
that sounds good.
Before we get to that, is there anything I missed in describing what the Secure Future Initiative is or the reasons behind it?
I think you put the context in quite clearly here for anybody who hasn't been following this particular space, so they understand where we're at. Did you want to cover some news first, though, before we head into it?
I did. I guess I wanted to so badly get to the Secure Future Initiative that I forgot are opening segments of the show. And of course, granted, this is the second show where we've done these opening segments. I'll get it right one of these days. So, but yes, before we dive into that, we've introduced the topic, but let's back up here for a second. And so every show I want to try to make it as timely as we possibly can, right? And so I figured every show would be fun to, kind of give my own, eye-catching news item that I came across in the tech space and that of my co-host, and as well as any fun tech projects that we're working on at the time of this recording, right? And so we are recording this episode on May 1st of 2025. And with that, I guess let's start with news items, Paul. I'll let you go first. What's a big news item that caught your eye in the tech world in the last, week or two?
I'll give you a doozy from the last few days. Oh, and by the way, it's the 2nd of May here in Australia, so I'm from the future.
That's very true.
I'm time traveling. So the one I've got to talk about briefly is SK Telecom, which happens to be, I've never heard of them, but they're one of the biggest telecom providers in South Korea. They have 23 million subscribers, and about 2 to 3 weeks ago, we saw an article come out that they had some sort of data breach, but there wasn't a lot of detail, and we were like, oh yeah, well, okay, so another telecom provider got hacked, like in the US, that's a Tuesday, you know what I mean? That's a normal Tuesday.
No joke.
Which is interestingly, as a sideline, which is interestingly because the CSRB's next report, had they continued to exist and not been killed off by the current administration in the US, would have been on the Salt Typhoon break-ins to like 7 or 8 of all your telcos over there.
Basically all the big ones.
Yeah, all the big ones. And basically they've been in there for month and month and month, and it took them months to get rid of them. So yeah, so that was going to be the next CSRB report, which we'll now never see. Anyway, so SK Telecom has some sort of hack. We don't know the details. And then 2 days ago, we find out that it looks like the attackers, whoever they were, I would guess North Korea, but we don't have any attribution at this point, had compromised the systems that generates the private keys that then generate physical SIM cards. So they are now scheduling replacement for their 23 million people subscribers of SIM cards. And they only have 1 million SIM cards on hand. So they now have to order and procure another 22 million SIM cards and schedule 23 million people to come into a store to have their SIM card replaced. So that's not going to be a cheap exercise. So, in the story of hacks of telecom providers, that's a doozy, I think.
That is one of those attacks that I feel extra bad for the sysadmins having to figure that out and deal with that. Can you imagine the guy that had to pick up the phone and call a SIM card manufacturer and say, hey, I need to place an order for 22 million SIM cards. Can you give me a bulk discount?
And also, can I have them by Tuesday? You know what I mean? That's the other thing. Right? And they're like, it's going to take us 6 months to make that. I don't know. I mean, it does make a case for eSIMs, the electronic SIMs. You don't actually have a physical SIM card.
That's very true. Oh, that's an interesting one. I'm going to have to read up on that one. It's certainly more interesting than the one that caught my eye today. And that was basically just one of the annual reports that Google puts out. They're very deep in the security side of the world now, especially with Mandiant being underneath them and Wiz, all the security brain power that they have under the building over there. But they reported that last year, 97 zero days were exploited. So in 2024, there were 97 zero days that were exploited in the wild and impacted, the tech world. So, and over 50% of those were spyware attacks. So, I can imagine, I'll link the article, but I can imagine if I, drill into who might be interested in launching spyware attacks, I could think of all kinds of nation state reasons to do so, or corporate espionage, or, cybercrime gangs looking to make a buck. It's probably all of the above, to be honest.
Yep.
So I'll link that in the show notes, and I'll link the article that Paul was talking about as well. So,
what's your interesting tech project?
So, I have learned more about Azure Static Web Apps and Hugo than I ever set out to learn. So, andyontech.com is hosted using Hugo and an Azure Static web app. And just yesterday, I finally stood up sysadminweekly.com. It's just a basic Hugo site with, 6 buttons on it, basically, that link you to the various places where you can find the show. So I guess that's a nice CTA, a call to action for folks on watching the show. If you're interested in all the different platforms we're on, you can go to sysadminweekly.com for that information. But, I've been doing a lot with, like I said, static web apps and Hugo. The thing I like about that combination for my blog and web app projects is I can utilize Markdown and GitHub Actions for the entire workflow for writing and authoring, and I get all the benefits of that built-in change control, right? Which is super nice with Git. So that's my project I've been working on lately. I don't know if you've got anything that you've been working with lately, Paul.
A quick, just for our listeners, in case they don't know, can you explain briefly what Hugo does and what a static website is compared to a dynamic?
That's a good point. There I go, assuming people have the same web know-how. So an Azure Static Web App is a hosting service in Microsoft Azure that is designed to host simple web applications that don't change, really. They're static. Once the site's built, it's hosted, and there's no fancy, intricate code running in the background, right? And so they're great for simple web apps. Now, what Hugo is it's kind of like Jekyll. Jekyll was like the first version of a static web app builder. So these are tools that will actually help you build static web apps using a unified framework. So it's as simple as installing Hugo on your machine, going out and choosing a theme that you want to use, and, Hugo new site build, basically. There's a couple of commands you run. And the other thing I really, really like about it is I can run a Hugo serve command on my local machine, and it spins up a Hugo web server locally on the system, so I can make sure that none of the changes I made are going to break my website before I upload it to production, which is nice, right? So anyway, that's what I've been working on lately.
Okay, and briefly for me, one of my clients so if you live in an urban area in the US or somewhere else in the world, you have no idea what I'm talking about, because getting bandwidth is super easy. We live out in the boonies here, and one of my clients is I wouldn't exactly call it rural, but could probably call it rural. They're about 15 minutes away from a town center, but where they are, they have no chance of getting any kind of decent internet. So they've been surviving on a really bad ADSL connection up until 5 years ago or so. Then we managed to get some radio internet, so they got a dish on their roof that connected them up. So that gave them 100 megabits or so down, which was a great improvement.
Yeah, it's not bad.
They got 125 people at the school, when everybody's there. So still not brilliant.
That changes things.
So in Australia, we have something called National Broadband Network, where they can run a fiber connection like they have to my house. But at this school, we now have their new wireless NBN connection. It's installed. I haven't actually gone there to turn it on yet. I've got to swap the cables into the firewall. But that is essentially a 5G or LTE connection to a dish that sits on the roof, and that they're on the fastest plan. So they're looking at 400 down, 40 up megabits. So that's going to be a great upgrade. So I'm really looking forward to giving them, like a 4x almost speed boost when I connect this thing. So.
Yeah, that'll be nice. Are they hosting anything in-house? Hopefully they don't have to update MX records or you don't have to update any DNS records or anything.
There's no MX records. They're line of business applications for the school so that staff and parents and things can connect after hours. There is a web server hosted there, but they are migrating to a cloud-hosted different platform. And that migration should finish sort of mid-year-ish, and then we'll get rid of that website as well. So then there won't be anything hosted there. So, but no, it's a different fixed IP address, I think, and then that's about it. I don't think there's a lot of changes I have to make. So,
yeah, the reason I ask is seemed like back in my service provider days, I was always the guy that drew the short straw for either internet connection change, so major WAN modifications, or they were moving buildings, so they were getting new internet service, maybe from the same provider, but certainly not the same static IP unless they were paying for that. And of course, you have to, this was back when, you hosted a lot of stuff in-house still. And I remember updating DNS records, and, that was in the days where, you know how today DNS providers, they say it's going to take 24 to 48 hours for this record change to propagate. It doesn't really seem to take that long anymore. Back then, it really did take that long. So, anyway.
As a quick sideline, the reason for that is that most of the DNS providers, at least all the major ones, they now have a push method. So the reason it took 48 hours was because all the DNS servers had to wait for somebody to ask about that new record, and then they would cache the new update, right? But now they literally will go out to all the big ones and say, hey, we now have an update. Put this in, please. And that's why it doesn't take 48 hours anymore.
Seems like that's something that could have been in the spec to begin with, but, I digress.
When they invented DNS, mate, that was like, what, 40 odd years ago?
It's only 40 years old.
Millions of nodes in a high-speed global connected internet. That wasn't part of their thinking, I think.
To be honest, it's amazing it works at all when you think about it, right? So,
It is. It is.
And of course, there's always that sysadmin joke of it's always DNS. It's always DNS. So, anyway.
It is.
Well,
all right.
Shall we get to the SFI, the Secure Future Initiative? So, we've kind of introduced what the SFI is, why it was announced, and the fact that Microsoft recently came out with a progress report back late April. And so if we step through what they've done so far, what they've done is extensive. They've announced a number of process changes, employee training changes, technical changes that culminates in what I see as a good... It's a good direction for hardening all of their, security and their services, right? And so what we're going to talk about here is by no means the entire list. But if you're interested in all the nitty-gritty details and all of the items that we are not going to talk about for sake of time in this episode, I'm going to include a link to the progress report in the show notes below. So be sure to check that out. But the first one that caught my eye, because it kind of starts at the beginning of the entire Microsoft ecosystem, and that is development, was the Secure by Design UX Toolkit. And so, we've heard a lot over the last couple of years about secure development practices and memory-safe languages like Rust and things like that, right? So there's very much a industry focus on security starting at the development stage. And so now that Microsoft has built a toolkit specifically designed to bring security best practices to developers, I think that's a win. I was really happy to see that. I'm not a developer by any stretch of the imagination, but it shows me that they're serious about, making security improvements at all facets of the organization, right? And to me, it always starts with development. So I think that was a good one that really caught my eye. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Paul.
I think it's a good one. And from my reading of it, it's very much focused. So they do mention golden paths and paved paths in a couple of other places in the report. So briefly, in case you're not a developer, the idea here is that when you have a lot of developers working, what you want to do is you want to provide them with an environment and the right open source packages and the right everything out, all the configuration and settings, so that the easy way for the developer to get going and build up their new features or whatever it is they're developing is also the most secure one, right? So you don't want a developer going off and say, oh, I want this bit and I want that bit and I want to change this, because then you're in a scenario where you might end up with insecure configurations or relying on insecure components. So you want that paved path being the easy path. And then the developers just follow that, and then they don't end up with credentials stored in GitHub, or they don't end up with insecure identification in their systems. Like that just doesn't happen, because the paved golden path, they just follow that. Now, it sounds like this UX thing very much is, how do you then present what you've built in a secure way to end users so that they don't get the option of clicking the wrong button and yeah, I don't know, getting the phishing email or something? How do you do that? So I think that's an interesting one. And that they were mentioning that they have 22,000 people are using inside of Microsoft, are using in their new systems. So that's very interesting, because that's going to hopefully lead to better UIs and more secure UIs, because it'll be much harder to shoot yourself in the foot, basically. So, so I like that.
Yeah,
I think that's cool.
Definitely.
And that's available publicly, by the way. So like you as an other company outside of Microsoft who are developing software with the UX for end users, you can grab that toolkit and use it for free.
For sure. I will include a link to that in the show notes as well. So the next item on the list, this is one that makes me raise my eyebrows a little bit. And I'll tell you why here after I tell you what it is. And that is they've stated that Entra ID and Microsoft account token signing operations have now been moved to HSMs, hardware security modules, and virtualization-based security in Windows with auto rotation via confidential compute. And so what raises my eyebrows about this, if you don't know what a HSM is, hardware security module, basically it is a fortified, ultra-secure hardware component that is designed entirely to store security keys, is basically what it is.
That's right. And you can think of these as, you can think of these as sitting in banks and those sorts of scenarios. And it's generally like a 1U or a 2U box. So it's literally like a rack-mounted server type thing. But it allows you to access keys and do things, but not extract the keys from the system. That's your traditional HSM.
Yep. And so why I raise my eyebrows at this is one question. Why wasn't it like this already? Right? Because I thought, correct me if I'm wrong here, Paul, maybe you've heard something different, but I thought that these features were already on HSMs. And I think this is one of the things that the CSRB called out when that report came out.
Steve Weinert, I think, at Microsoft gave a good presentation a year and a half ago at a Build conference or an Ignite conference, one of those. And he talked about this. And he talked about that they were moving towards this. Now, here's the challenge. When you think of this in a bank or in a data center somewhere, you have one or two HSMs or whatever, they are not globally distributed. So the challenge here is that Entra ID is globally distributed. So now you've got to have these boxes in every data center. Okay, that's fine. But remember, you can't extract the keys. Now, how do you build a system so that the right keys are available globally, stored securely, but not being copied out of the things and auto-rotated? I think that was the challenge. That's why it was so hard to build this thing, to make it globally redundant and having the keys everywhere, but still stored in a secure way and in HSMs.
Right.
I think that was a part of it. The other quick note there, in case you haven't heard of confidential computing, this is another big push by Microsoft and the entire industry, but I think Microsoft is a leader in Azure. This is where you can have VMs or containers that are encrypted, and their memory is encrypted based on hardware features out of AMD or Intel processors and coming in the ARM processors as well. That makes it impossible for anyone, including Microsoft engineers who have physical access to the servers, to access anything that goes on inside of these confidential computing machines. So it's interesting that they're moving that technology in there as well. And one of the things they mentioned in the report, that all new Azure servers now has a mini hardware security module built into the physical server itself. So that's another interesting take.
It is, yeah. So I wonder if what it was, and Microsoft is traditionally really bad at communicating things, right? And so I wonder if, like you said, they had been working on this. And so the perception in parts of the industry, myself included, it sounds like, was, oh, they're using hardware security modules. And to your point, yes, absolutely. I could totally see how it would be difficult to architect an HSM solution for a global marketplace. So I think what their progress report shows now is, like, they saw that as a critical thing to finally take care of, and they did. And so that's a good move in my opinion. And I think the confidential compute stuff is really interesting to me as well too, because we've always talked as sysadmins about encryption at rest and encryption in transit, right? But we never stopped to think about the fact that while data is being computed, it is not in an encrypted state, right? And so, confidential compute comes and kind of takes care of that last, area of the entire data lifecycle, right? Which is nice. So, good moves. Next item on my list, and this is, I wrote this down as a general item because there were many, many line items in the progress report that fell into this category. And the one thing I've seen several places in the report was what amounted to an improvement of red team capabilities within Microsoft. So the ability for red teams, offensive security people, increasing their capabilities, being able to, give them the tools that they need to spot vulnerabilities quicker and sooner. There was AI mentioned as part of some of those capabilities as well too. And so I can only imagine what it's like being a red teamer for an organization like Microsoft with all of the infrastructure that they have. And I know you have a statistic that you were going to mention a little bit later, Paul, but wasn't it 6 million tenants, I think is what the statistic was?
So, one of the reasons they got compromised originally by Storm 0558 was because there was a test tenant that had an application that had some sort of permissions inside of the production tenant. And the test tenant's user accounts did not have MFA. They got password sprayed. The Russians got in there and then got into the production tenant and essentially created an exchange system application that was acting as exchange system. And that's how they read emails out of all these inboxes, including the State Department in the US. And so, go on.
I was going to say, this was one of the other attacks on top of Storm 0558, if I remember right. This was the attack by Midnight Blizzard, if I remember correctly.
Yes, you're right. They do blur. So maybe my attribution of who did what is wrong, but it was definitely the Russians.
Right. But the point stands, regardless of which attack we're talking about, right? And so, I mean,
That's
6 million tenants.
Yeah, so
Like
what that means is that they are getting rid of all these non-production tenants. So people at Microsoft for years, clearly, and this happens in lots of other businesses as well, at least large ones, they're spinning up test tenants, right? They're developing something for Microsoft 365. They need a test environment to do it in, so they spin up a test tenant. So across the 200 and whatever thousand people working at Microsoft, they have managed to amass 6 million test tenants, and now they've got rid of all of those. So
I I know it's automation. It has to be automation, but how do you amass 6 million tenants? It's just insane. Like I know
6.3
organizations.
million. 6.3
Uh,
million tenants is the actual figure.
and so I know organizations that struggle to manage 3 tenants, let alone 6.3 million. I just and so why I bring that up and through the prism of talking about red teamers at Microsoft is you can't pen test 6.3 million tenants. It's not possible.
Well, that's why they got rid of them. They literally just canned them all. that's job done.
Yeah, that's one way to secure things, I guess. So good to see that's being taken care of. The other thing here that they were a little nebulous about was the role of AI in some of their new security capabilities.
I can tell you what that is. That's Security Copilot. So having delivered a course on Security Copilot recently, so for those of you who don't know, this is based on one of the latest OpenAI LLM models, but on top of that, Microsoft has built an orchestrator engine, and then they integrate this into Entra ID and into Sentinel and Defender XDR and Purview and Intune. And this is a fantastic technologies, can do a lot of really, really cool things. They've recently, like literally in the last couple of weeks, they've added agents on top of that. So you can have autonomous agents running under Security Copilot, do things like one of the most common things that SOC analysts have to do is analyze phishing submissions from end users, right? So end users get a funky email. They go, oh, this might be phishing. They send it off to the SOC team, and some poor sod that the SOC team now has to look through, dozens of these every day. And you can't just say, oh, no, it looks okay. You actually have to investigate whether it is bad or not. And in 90% of cases, it's probably just spam. It's not actual phishing, but you still need to investigate. So now they have an agent that will do that automatically for you and give you a verdict at the end. And you can check out how it got to that verdict. And that then saves a lot of time. As an example, they got another agent for analyzing conditional access policies.
Right.
The only problem with Security Copilot is it's incredibly expensive. But of course, because you're paying per hour for some nebulous figure of SCUs, secure computer units, and as an enterprise using this technology, you have no idea how many of this you're going to use. So, but Microsoft doesn't pay for them in-house. So I would assume that they're using Security Copilot everywhere to spot security issues.
I would assume so, yeah. And that's the one thing that I feel like they weren't super clear about in their progress reports. The progress report is just basically, hey, we're using AI to help with security. Where maybe I'm one of those guys that I like the devil's in the details, right? So it's like, okay, how? And yeah, I figured it was Sentinel, but it'd be nice to know, like, exactly how are you using Sentinel? And I mean, part of that's, I'm sure, operational security, right? They don't want to give away too many details. But again, it was just, I felt like an interesting omission as back to that, we're going to make it as generic as we can for that particular part. Anyway.
I suspect you're right about the OPSEC. They don't want to tell the bad guys where they're using AI and not, and exactly what they're using it for and not.
Yep.
So the other one, I think that we're looking at the figures here, and there's a lot of figures in this report. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of them. A lot of statistics of how they made progress on their 28 objectives and so forth. But one of them is, I think, as a cultural one, and if you want to use this as a catalyst for doing something similar in your enterprise, wherever you work as a sysadmin, is making security a core priority. So they now have that in their performance reviews. Every year they have a performance review, and every employee at Microsoft now has, how did you contribute to security at Microsoft? Every employee, not just the developers who are actually writing the code. There's a bunch of other people doing other stuff at Microsoft,
Right.
but they have to look at security. So I think that's really interesting.
I think, to me, that's a big one, because it brings security front of mind for every single employee. And I think when you're an organization that is as involved in computing for the entire planet as Microsoft is, that's a necessity. Everybody needs to be thinking about security, in my opinion. So I think that's a good one. And that ties in with another thing that they're doing for employees, and that is increased security training. So again, there were some specific figures in the report, but in general terms, employees are getting more security training at Microsoft, which is a good thing. So, couple other items on my list. I know you had a couple to cover that stood out to you as well, Paul. There are now 14 deputy CISOs across Microsoft. These are CISOs that are assigned to specific business units. And one of the core goals that they have currently is identifying risk for their particular estates, right? The other thing that stood out to me was that 92% of employee accounts are now using phishing-resistant MFA. So to me, that's passkeys. That just screams passkeys to me. Passkeys.
I'm sure there are a fair bit of passkey usage, but also that would be Windows Hello for Business. Because remember, if you're using Windows Hello for Business,
that's true.
Device, right? Then that is also locked to the real login page. You phish somebody and send them off to a fake page that looks like the real one. That ain't going to work. It'll just say error. So
that's true. And see, and maybe this is because I'm a Mac user. Windows Hello for Business never comes top of mind for me. And I know that they have really been beating the drum on passkeys for the last 6 to 12 months, I think. And so, absolutely good point. Windows Hello for Business. It's one of those services that I don't often think about. So, see, that's why you're on the show, Paul, is to, remind me of the service. What's that?
They did also mention in the report that they are smoothing the path to procure FIDO keys. So for those who want FIDO keys, you can also purchase those, which of course are phishing resistant as well. So
Yep, definitely. And the other one here that I found interesting is they now have 4.4 million environment managed identities now restricted by geography. So I can only imagine being the team that had to sort all that out for 4.4 million managed identities. So all good things, right? And so with that, that's my list. I know you got a couple of things you wanted to bring up, Paul.
I do. I just want to give a quick explanation there. So if you have Enter ID today, which everybody who uses Microsoft 365 does, and you do use managed identities and service principals, there is a feature called workload identities that allows you to apply conditional access policies to your workload identities. And you can do exactly what Microsoft has done here. You can say, well, this thing is only ever going to run in this region or in this Azure data center or in this on-premises location, wherever it's running. And you can lock that down with these conditional access policies. So if the bad guys get in, they compromise that application somehow and then try to access resources somewhere else, the policy is just going to say, well, no, you don't go over here ever. So you're not going to go over here now, and you're blocked from it. So that's kind of cool. There's a couple of things to mention. The one is that Microsoft held an event called Zero Day Quest for the first time in the last couple of weeks ago. It was a 3-day conference, and they basically invited the top security researchers / hackers from their bug bounty programs. So the people who had found already a bunch of bugs and vulnerabilities in Microsoft's products and reported them. And they invited them to this conference, and they didn't, like, the participants didn't even know what they were there for. But clearly they have been hacking on Azure and related services for those 3 days, and they found 180 vulnerabilities that Microsoft are now in the progress of fixing.
Wow.
So I thought that was kind of interesting.
180.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
One of the reasons we didn't get all the details from the Russians hacking Microsoft was because they didn't have logs going back that far. One of the things they mentioned in the report is that they now have a minimum of 2 years retention of logs from everywhere. It has some sort of statistics of exactly how far they've gotten on everywhere so far, but a lot of it. So they're keeping everything for 2 years. So it's another interesting thing. I mentioned the secure compute and local HSM is in every new server. I think that's what we wanted to cover, really.
Yeah. So again, not a comprehensive list of every single data point they cover in the reports, just the ones that really stand out. Again, I'm going to include a link to the report in the show notes, so if you want to go read all the details, by all means, take a look at that. And again, tying this back to SysAdmins, Paul, I think for me, at the end of the day, when I'm doing my job, I'm trying to secure the business I work for. I'm trying to keep my end users safe, trying to keep the company I work for safe. I need to be able to trust the software vendor that I'm using on my systems. And I think if we went back, you and I have had this conversation on camera, if we go back to November of 2023, didn't have a lot of trust in Microsoft at that particular moment, right? Because, they really dropped the ball a couple of times in very short succession. And so I think, if I kind of had to, grade them on their progress of the SFI, I would have to say I'm impressed. They've come a long way, and they keep moving along like this. I think it's going to be good for the whole industry.
Yeah, it all comes in waves, right? I don't think they dropped the ball in rapid succession. I think they'd been dropping the ball for a few years.
Yeah.
And we didn't know about it because it hadn't come to light yet. And I think then, once they found one dropped ball, then they started finding all these other dropped balls. So within a short succession of, a year and a half or whatever, we got all these different breaches that they'd had, which was terrible. And yes, I completely agree with you. I think it's incredibly important to be able to trust your software vendors. And I am now back to trusting Microsoft a lot more than I trust a lot of other software vendors that I use in my clients' environments. And essentially, it's down to somebody asks, "Hey, can we install this app on everybody, on every student's laptop?" And I'm like, "Do we have to? Can we use a cloud service instead?"
Right.
Because you don't put that software on your endpoint because it's crap. Like all software is different levels of crap. So there is a risk there for sure. So I think Microsoft is doing well. Imagine trying to turn around a gigantic ship of hundreds of thousands of people.
It's like deer in the Titanic, that's for sure. I can only imagine. So, well, Paul, I know this is the first time we've had you on the show. It will not be the last time. Excuse me. How can people get a hold of you if they have a question or they want to say, hey, I don't know if there's a website you want to direct them to or social media?
Yeah, I'll give you my blog. I've got a blog, tell it as it is, or tellit.com.au. That's available. I'll give you the link to it so you don't have to remember that. And otherwise, if you want to connect with me, LinkedIn is a good place. So I'll give you the link to my LinkedIn profile as well, and then you can pop that in the show notes so people can reach out to me there. And I'm always happy to talk to any sysadmin or any IT pro, really.
Sounds good. Appreciate that, Paul. And for us, folks, you know how to get a hold of us. If you've been a regular viewer of the show, you can contact us at contact@sysadminweekly.com. If you have questions funny sysadmin stories, horrifying sysadmin stories would work too, but I always cringe when I hear those. Be sure to share those with us. I would love at some point to have an interesting enough sysadmin story to share on the air, or maybe do a collection of them, like, I don't know, the top 10 listener sysadmin horror stories or something like that would be very interesting. So again, contact at sysadminweekly.com. Again, we are also available not just on YouTube, but we're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as Amazon. And well, with that, I think that's wraps it up for us, Paul. I appreciate you spending some time with us today.
No worries. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Definitely. And thanks for watching, folks. We'll catch you again next week for another episode of SysAdmin Weekly. Have a good one.